Once upon a time, there was a princess so grand, who invited all the fair gentry of the land. But her nearest and dearest were cast aside, and now it is time to turn the tide. A couple of months ago, I made a video about the relationship between Wallis Simpson and the Duke of Windsor, formerly known as Edward VIII, called The Original. The reason I made it was because ever since Meghan joined the fray, many commentators and many people have been drawing lots of parallels between Meghan and Harry and Wallis and Edward, especially after Megxit, calling them both outcasts, effectively exiled from royal life. In fact, I recently heard only a couple of days ago, yet another commentator draw this comparison, which is what inspired this video, this time specifically in relation to the Sussex's status as outcasts, even in the US, after the latest Hollywood snub that Meghan has apparently experienced. If you don't know what I'm talking about, last week the makeup brand Anastasia Beverly Hills threw a huge party to celebrate its 25th anniversary, and pretty much anyone who was anyone in Hollywood was invited, specifically females, and I've noticed of a certain age, around Meghan's age group and older. The event also happened to coincide with Oprah's 69th birthday. So a cake was brought out, people wished her a happy birthday, Kim Kardashian and the like posted on Instagram, photos from the event where everyone was clearly mingling and having fun on Oprah's birthday. Now Meghan, who very famously and openly lives right down the road in Montecito, was nowhere to be seen. And this isn't the first time that she and Harry were notably absent at a big event. Obama's 60th birthday bash a couple of years ago, anyone? We know that Meghan is a huge fan of Michelle Obama, so that was definitely a snub. Initially, I didn't really think much of this news because after all, one's worth is not measured by the number of invitations that they get to big events. However, we are dealing with Meghan Markle here. And when you cast your mind back to her and Harry's wedding, where the church was teeming, and the reception, of course, with strangers. Famous strangers, granted, but strangers nonetheless. Amal Clooney was famously overheard stating that she didn't know the Sussexes, and yet she scored an invitation. And yet there was only one member of Meghan's own family, being, of course, her mother Doria. So when you consider this, what can seem as petty news of, oh, who cares if she wasn't invited, suddenly turns into a more meaningful message. Perhaps one of karma? Now, there have been at least two stories surrounding why Meghan wasn't present at this event. And surprise, surprise, they're both contradictory. Do I have lipstick on my teeth? No. The first reason, which also happens to be the most widespread, is that Meghan did indeed receive an invite, but decided not to show up because it's a very delicate situation given Harry's memoir and the Netflix series and then the upcoming coronation. And so she wants to keep a low profile. She doesn't want to stir the pot, doesn't want to create a circus around her presence anywhere. In other credible news, I looked out the window today and saw flying pigs. The other reason is, given that this was an Anastasia Beverly Hills anniversary party, only women who actively supported the brand were invited, which directly contradicts the first reason because, as I said, the first reason states that Meghan was indeed invited. She just chose not to come. So which is it? Coincidentally, a photo of Meghan and Harry gets leaked a mere few hours, I think, after this news of the snub started circulating in the media, of the two of them at Portia de Rossi's birthday party. And Portia is Ellen DeGeneres' wife. And during this party, they also happened to renew their vows. But, that's besides the point. The actual point is yet another perfectly timed leak, apparently to prove that Meghan is some kind of a relevant person in Hollywood because there she is at Ellen's, wife's birthday party. Ellen being canceled Ellen for being a bully, which, talk about a coincidence? It's funny because every time she acts this way, every time she leaks a photo to contradict a certain narrative, you just know it got to her. You know that she felt snubbed. You know that she doesn't want the world to believe that story, when she could have just, kept her head up high and went, yeah, big deal. I wasn't invited. That doesn't define who I am and my worth. But again, we're talking about Meghan Markle here, who very clearly, based on the TIG and her Instagram and everything about her, honestly, everything I've learned about her through Tom Bower's book and her own content, like I said, her own social media accounts, clearly places so much value on her status and her worth based on the number of famous people that she knows or is photographed with or, happens to rub shoulders with. We even saw it on Archetypes. Pretty much all of her guests were Hollywood elite. Now back to that Sussex-Windsor comparison. If you've watched my video, the original, or the countless documentaries out there, if you've read books about them, then you'd probably know already that there are many differences between the Sussexes and the Windsors, many of which I've covered in my video, but some of which I haven't, and I want to cover a couple of those in this video. Firstly, in response to the comment of Meghan and Harry being exiled from a life of royalty, they chose to leave not only the royal family, but the UK altogether, which is in direct contrast to Edward and Wallis, who were forced to leave. They were actually exiled. As I said in the original, Edward was given an ultimatum. You either forget about Wallis or maybe even have her as a mistress, or if you want to marry her, you abdicate. And of course, we all know what he ended up choosing. Contrast that to Harry and Meghan, who were given titles, royal titles of the Duke and Duchess of Sussex as a wedding gift by the Queen, may she rest in peace. Secondly, Edward, despite being a rebel prince, in his own right, still respected the monarchy and his brother's eventual rule. In fact, based on what I know, if he were allowed to marry Wallis and remain as king because he wanted to make her his queen, then he wouldn't have even abdicated. He would have continued to reign as monarch and emperor with his beloved wife by his side. I mean, the man was heartbroken when not one family member or old friend attended the very intimate, very small wedding that he had with Wallis in France. And that was because he invited them, firstly, and truly thought that at least someone would show up. Contrast that to Meghan and Harry, who, with their flippant remark about their multi-million-dollar wedding being for the public, being just for show, and how the real wedding was a private moment that never even happened 3 days prior. And you can easily see we're comparing chalk and cheese here. Secondly, and probably the most important point, Edward and Wallis didn't make a career out of airing out their dirty linen and make a mockery out of not only their family, but themselves, which is exactly what Harry and Meghan have been doing. Edward and Wallis did quite the opposite, in fact. They carried on with their heads high, not once publicly smearing their family's reputations or the monarchy's reputation, and instead choosing to project this image of marital bliss and ultra glamour. Quite the opposite of being victims, if you ask me. And this is something I talk about in the original, so I'm not gonna talk about it in any detail here, but Wallis was indeed hounded and reviled by not only the media, but the British public. She was hounded, she was stalked and harassed. Everything that Meghan claims happened to her without any evidence, we have evidence of it happening to Wallis. And yet, she never complained publicly once, and more importantly, never waged a war against the media and the royal family, who, by all accounts, rejected her. And this isn't a defense of Wallis. I'm sure at the time, the way that the family responded was appropriate. But the point I'm trying to make here is you have on the one hand, one woman who was actually on the receiving end of a witch hunt, effectively, who was exiled out of a country and basically forced to live with her husband outside of the UK, and who was not welcomed by the family, and yet she didn't lie down and take it like a victim and decided to live life on her own terms. Contrast that, of course, to Meghan Markle, who, if you ask me, based on what I just said, is the personification of the exact opposite of what Wallace Simpson chose to do. The most that I know that Edward did was write to his family privately for the rest of his life, urging them to style Wallace with a HRH title, which never happened. But again, he never took that fight public. The only major stain against them, as far as I'm aware, is, if you don't know, this might shock you, their association, their very unfortunate association with the Nazis and with Hitler specifically at the time. But I'm strictly talking about the airing out of dirty linen here and waging a needless war against the media. And that is absolutely something that Edward and Wallace did not do. As for the comment about Edward and Wallace being outcasts, sure, they were exiled from the UK. So yes, effectively they were outcasts in relation to the royal family. But from what I can see from the footage, and like I said, the hours and hours of documentaries I watched about them, while they were shunned by the royal family, they weren't necessarily shunned by the creme de la creme of global society, and they lived out most of their lives in France. From what I can see, they were still very much involved in that social set. They were invited and they were welcomed. But based on how the past 3 years have panned out for Meghan and Harry since they moved to California, the same can't really be said about them. What was clearly a master plan to become the toast of Hollywood has clearly failed. Instead, they've ended up leaving a family, a tight-knit family, and isolated themselves in this huge 16-bathroom mansion with only a handful of people, if that, to celebrate certain milestones, based on photos we've been seeing of, for example, Lily's birthday or Archie's birthday, Archie's first Christmas. It's just all so solitary and so lonely, when instead they could have been surrounded by their aunts and uncles, their cousins, their grandparents, for a time even their great-grandparents. I even noticed on Netflix, their docuseries, that most of their friends, at least the ones featured, at least the ones willing to come out and speak on their behalf, are either staff or people who stand to benefit personally out of an association with them. They really appear to be isolated unless they're hiding, the social aspect of their personal lives, which I highly doubt, because it completely goes against their modus operandi, which, like I said, involves leaking photos of them at certain get-togethers and barbecues and events to prove that we're living a good life here in California. We have a nice thing going on, which is something they keep repeating on and on and on and on every chance they get, which makes you start to wonder how true that really is. It's no secret that their popularity in the US has plummeted significantly since the release of the docuseries and Harry's book Spare, more so, I think. Which tells you everything you need to know about why Hollywood and politicians like the Obamas, people that Meghan would do a lot to be seen with, to be photographed with, why they continue to snub the Sussexes, despite many events and opportunities for them to be invited and to be seen. The simple fact is, no one likes attention seekers. No one likes whingers. And no one likes traitors who are willing to sell out their own kin for a hefty paycheck. I mean, think about it from Hollywood's point of view. If this is what the Sussexes are willing to do to their own families on such a global scale, mercilessly, ruthlessly, and unprovoked, then what are they capable of doing to everyone else? So that's why I think it's unfair to compare the Sussexes to the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, who, by all accounts, kept to themselves. Because when you actually look at their story, when you don't just listen to what the media is feeding, or when you don't just read a headline or repeat something that someone told you, they really don't seem to have a lot in common at all. Apart from Wallace's ambition to social climb and the fact that she used the prince, eventually a king, to do that, because based on what I've seen in my research, I think that is an indisputable fact. So I guess she has one thing in common with Meghan Markle. It's a really ironic tale with the Sussexes. They want world power, they want global adulation, and the fact is they had both of these things only a few years ago. only to then squander it before our very eyes, all due to their uncontrollable hubris. Oh, how the mighty have fallen. I bet you after this snub, Meghan's like, Harry, we're going to that coronation because our royal clout is running out. Hey, that rhymed. Maybe I should reconsider this YouTube thing and be a rapper instead.